It is true. I guess my first and most intense exposure to your side of things in agriculture was as I think I need to set the record straight here a little bit. I worked on the plant breeding team at Cornell, but I was not exactly on the scientific side. I was the labor, and one thing that really struck me in terms of walking around the presentation space out there was I realize this is an understatement, but the incredible advances and progression of what's happened in genetics since then. This would have been in the mid-1970s. I graduated from Cornell in '78. That's happened. On one side of me wishes that this was all in place when I was back there working out in the fields, but on the other hand, I probably wouldn't have had a job back then. So maybe it all worked out really well. As Robbie said, what I want to do is walk you through what we see as what's going on in agriculture from a macroeconomic standpoint. We work with companies up and down the supply chain from the input side of things. A lot of companies that are here we have a relationship with in various ways, all the way down to the food side. We work with a lot of supermarkets and food retail, food supply, food manufacturing, transportation companies, and again, the fertilizer, crop protection, and seeds. So we have a pretty good vision of what's going on in the sector. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is just tell you what we're seeing out there and what we're telling people up and down the chain in terms of where we think things are going. Because I think one of the things that's an issue right now is the low price environment that we're in. And we get a lot of questions about, how did we get here? Why did we get in this lower price environment than what we've been used to, and where are we going to go from here? Are we going to? Is there a prospect for prices increasing? So that's sort of the theme of what I'd like to talk about. Ravi, do I advance it from the keyboard here? Okay. And here are the sort of, let's say, major topical areas, and I'll just really be hitting the highlights. Each one of these you could actually make into a presentation in and of itself, but I want to talk about sort of some of the broad macro drivers, and then it's almost inescapable to talk about politics and policies. And in fact, we do think there are going to be some things, at least, that we need to keep on the radar, looking out for, because there have been some fairly significant shifts in the landscape, and we'll talk about how that impacts the business. Population and demographics, you've heard the themes about the growing demand out there, and I want to take you down a couple levels to give you maybe a little bit different perspective on what that looks like. Then global crop production and the price outlook, those two things very much related. We'll give you a picture of where we think things are going. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the drivers of production, what we look at, especially when we look at acreage mixes, whether it's around the world or here in the United States. And then some things going on in the industry, a lot of things you're very familiar with, and just some perspectives from what we're seeing on that. So that's sort of the overview here for today. Okay, on the macro drivers, and I'm going to linger on this a little bit because I think it gives a great history, and it makes a couple of key points. If you look at this chart, starting back in the, I guess it starts back, in the early 1970, and you look at that red arrow that's on there, and you see basically the trend line, and these are all commodities. And one of the points I want to make is that agriculture, and I learned this lesson over the years, agriculture does not live in a void. Okay, we're very connected in many ways to the energy sector. We're connected in many ways to what's going on in mining and metals. It's very close connections in the commodity world between agriculture and the other sectors. So this is sort of an overall index of all commodity prices. And if you look at that era from the 1970s right up to about, let's say, 2000, 2002, it was an era of declining commodity prices. Those little spike ups that you see in the boxes there, basically those are supply-driven spike ups. And what I mean by that, there was an OPEC embargo there. It drove oil prices higher. There were a couple of droughts in there, major droughts. It drove the ag prices higher. But by and large, those spikes aside, we were in an era of declining prices, and the consequence of that, and I had the good fortune of starting in the business. As I said, I graduated as an undergrad in '78. I got an MBA, but I started in that early era in the 1980s. Had I seen what this chart was going to look like, had I been in the forecasting business back then, I might not have entered the industry, because it was a very, very difficult time. When you're in an era like that of generally low prices and declining prices, one of the things that happens is that you don't attract a lot of interest. You don't interest a lot of money in terms of investing in the business, whether it's technology, whether it's infrastructure. And so we went through this very long period where agriculture specifically, so you could say the commodity area in general, didn't really attract a lot of investment. All of the research and the tremendous amount of time and money that you see represented at this conference, that would have been a very, very that was not known during that period. And those of you who worked through that period know that the atmosphere and the environment was quite a bit different. But if you go to the end of that arrow and go to about the year 2000, that's a very significant event happened then. China entered the WTO. And when China entered the WTO, and that's not the only thing that happened, I'll talk about a couple of other things, but the consequence of that was that it opened up this era of expanded trade. And in the agricultural economics field, we talk a lot about things like comparative advantage. That what global trade does, it allows one country to focus on one thing they're really good at, and they stop doing other things because some other country is better at that, and you kind of have this global trade, and you have efficiency gains and all these good things. And I think a lot of those things did happen in that era that started, the last 15 years ago, a little more than 15 years ago in 2000. Other trade agreements came in place, and we had generally a period of expanding trade, expanding incomes in a lot of developing countries. And with expanding incomes, you have increased demand for protein. You've heard this story before, right? Increasing demand for protein. You need more things like soybean meal and corn and soybean oil, and so that led to that price increase that you see going on from 2000 onward. Now, there are a couple of other things that happened then that were important as well. You had the advent of biofuels. That was a significant additive piece to the demand during that period, and that was on top of what was going on with this expanded global trade and the opening up of China. So a lot going on, and I could talk a lot about this chart, but I want to give you a little bit of perspective. And to bring you up to date, you can see the economic recession that took commodity prices down, but we've settled off at a level that's higher than where we were, but below the peak. But it's pretty, where we are right now is probably a good representation, at least that range, of where we're going to be in the future. The main point that I want to leave with you, and you'll see it in other charts that I have here, but the main point I want to leave with you is that this big increase since 2000, it's different from those other little sporadic price increases that we saw before, in that it was demand driven and not supply driven. We had true underlying demand that grew, and that was the big uplift in prices. And from our perspective, that demand base is still there. The reason prices have been low the past couple, 3 years, and we still have to work through it, is that we've had tremendous world production. In a sense, you all have done maybe your job a little too well. Yields have held up very well, but we've had some very good fortune in terms of good weather in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and we just have had a tremendous increase in production over that time, and we have to chew through that to get to a period of higher prices than where we are today. Okay, politics and policy, and I'm gonna go through this real quick. Probably everybody's pretty sick and tired of talking about politics and policy, but there's a difference between the two, and I want to focus on the policy more than the politics. At least in the United States, and we've seen, there's other things we can talk about, Brexit or political changes in South America, but I think one of the dangers that we see right now is that we are entering a bit of a different era and a different way of thinking about these trade agreements. And from an agricultural standpoint, the thing that we have to look out for is that we are actually a huge exporter to China, we being the United States, South America as well. Whereas the conversation about trade over the last year has all been about the importing side, manufactured goods, iPhones and everything else. But ag goes in the other direction. So to the extent that we renegotiate NAFTA and that we put on restrictions on trade from China, we can expect consequences on the ag side that will not be good and interrupt, that flow out of exporting countries into some of those big demand bases. So that's something we really need to think about, and there are some very specific issues on here. I think in our view, Donald Trump is not anti-trade, but he does want to renegotiate these trade agreements. I think eventually it'll be okay, but it will be a bumpy ride getting from here to there because there will be tweets, there will be meetings, there will be press reports, and those things can have negative impacts on the market. So that's just something that I think to monitor and to watch as time goes on. Energy and biofuels, already talked about it a little bit. I think if we did change significantly the biofuels policy in the United States, it would have obviously a very negative impact on agriculture. I don't think that's going to happen. But again, like the trade policy, definitely something we need to keep our eyes on and make sure that we're on the right track. And from a demand standpoint, at least from my perspective for agriculture, I think that's an important piece. I think the thing that's working in biofuels' favor is the idea for the United States of energy independence. I think it also fits well. I think we've gotten past the food versus fuel debate, where people were worried that we were running out of feedstock for the food industry because of the competition for feedstock from the biofuels industry. I think we're past that. So I think the potential for policy shift is there, but we think it's probably okay for now. One of the issues that's very, very important to agriculture is labor. I was telling Ravi, before we came in here, that as we work with and we talk with farmers and farm organizations all over the world, and whether you're talking to them in North America or Brazil or Australia, New Zealand, China, you ask them what the number one problem is, and almost always they will say it's labor. As we get the scale of farms bigger, the technology more complex, and let's face it, it's if you're a young, bright Brazilian, graduate from a technical university, I'm thinking you're probably going to want to live in Rio rather than somewhere in Mato Grosso, And so this is something that we see as a big issue moving forward. How are we going to get the supply of labor coming into agriculture? And for the U.S. specifically, again, it's like as with the trade issue, it can be a very negative consequence to agriculture if we take a different posture with respect to immigration, because recent immigrants are very, very important to the ag sector, whether it's on the crop side or the animal side. And so, just that's an issue that we have on our watch list, and wanted to mention it. I think one positive, getting back to the trade and maybe in general, and at least I don't think, I've been traveling, so I don't think we've appointed a Secretary of Agriculture yet, but I think one of the big positives and comforting appointments that was made was Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa, was appointed the ambassador to China. He's close personal friends with President Xi of China. They've known each other for 20, 25 years when they were both lower level politicians. Their families are friends. They've stayed at each other's house. I think that was a very interesting appointment, and a very positive one if we're thinking that the ag trade with China, and it is, if we're thinking it's important, it's I think it was a very good appointment. It'll serve agriculture well. In this chart, I kind of put this up. It's this biofuels versus China demand, and this is if you put it in the context of acres needed, you can see that we went through this period where both biofuels and demand from China were pulling on acres out of agriculture, and as we've had the biofuels demand, it's really flattened out. We're at the we're at the top of the renewable fuel standard, what we need. So that's pretty much leveled off, and yield increases will take care of any demand from that sector moving forward. So we're really moving into an era where, yes, we think that demand from China is still strong, it's still there, However, we don't have that extra juice, if you will, from something else, which in this case was biofuels. But you can see why prices were going up so rapidly in that era, leading up to 2012, that 5 or 6 years, because there was tremendous demand pull from the market from both of those things, from China and from biofuels. Okay, population and demographics, and I'm going to go through the first 2 slides quickly because I think it's a well-known story. The population growth, it is decelerating, but it's still a major driver. You can see on here that China is relatively flat, but as we look forward, sub-Saharan Africa and to a certain extent the Middle East, those are going to be population drivers. That's only a tiny part of the story, though, and unfortunately I think a lot of people talk just in terms of population, and this is a huge area. But just to give you just a couple of perspectives on it, one thing that's overlooked oftentimes is the age profile of the population. You can see on the left, this is the kind of the percentage of the population age 65 and over. You can see in developed countries that's accelerating rapidly, but you can see that China actually, if you look at, and that's the chart on the right, if you look at their population, what's interesting about them is that they are at the peak in terms of their sort of working age population. And that has consequences in terms, it doesn't mean that food demand goes down, but it means it changes to different things. It also has consequences. We talked about labor before in agriculture. It has consequences to labor. We've seen wages and labor availability quite different in China today than it was 20 years ago or 15 years ago when they entered the WTO. So kind of a different perspective on things. But this last chart, and I'll put both things up here. If you look at the chart on the left, what we really look at is not necessarily the population growth, but the piece of that population that's entering the middle class. And middle class is a hard thing to measure, and so sometimes we use urbanization as a proxy. And so if you look at the chart on the left, that's urbanization that's occurred in different parts of the world, and you can see that China and Asia in general, that's where a lot of the urbanization has occurred over the last 10 years or so. But as we look forward, we are certainly going to see more urbanization in China, but sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world are going to play a bigger role in terms of that urbanization, and consequently the growth of the middle class, and then consequently the growth of food demand and protein demand that is a primary driver of agriculture. So I think the main thing that I want to leave with you today in this area is that the demand base is still there. We're going through a period of big supplies, but that demand base is still very intact. Now we have some things to worry about on the policy side, and there's always things that can go wrong, but I think there's been a lot of concern over the last couple of years that we're entering another one of those long eras of low and declining commodity prices, and that's not the way we see it in agriculture. And this is just a forward look on, if you want to pick one commodity in one country as sort of a benchmark for what the drivers of agriculture are, that would be Chinese demand for soybean imports. And you can see here the bars are the imports, and the kind of the shaded in space is the usage part. And we really don't, actually I have to tell you, in terms of from a forecasting task, this is kind of a forecaster's dream, because you can look back and there are little variations over time and things that happen, but we don't see anything really that's going to change, at least from a economic standpoint, that's going to change that trajectory in terms of soybean imports. Okay, global crop production, and as we look forward, we think about this demand. What does it mean for the mix of crops? The crop area is concentrating, and really that title should say wheat and corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice. If you look at the bars, we continue to see this migration to corn and soybeans, and to a certain extent rice. We expect that to continue. And again, that's as you get those growing middle classes, that's what you need for protein type of demand, and we will continue to see that in the future. So the question is, where are we going to see it? And this chart, if you look at where we think the crop area is going to expand, you can see South America, Africa, and to a lesser extent, maybe India. That blue on the far left, that's North America. Actually, we see crop acreage going down, and it will go up in other parts of the world to meet that demand. But I think the thing that I want to point out to this group is really on the next chart, and this is production increases. If you compare that to the previous chart, we will see acreage expansion in places like Africa, for example, but a disproportionate amount of the production is going to come from places like South Africa. And what that means is there's tremendous opportunity in places like Africa for to really get the yields that will give you increased production. Right now, the rest of the world is having to carry a disproportionate share of that load. So as we go down the road, I think that's probably one of the things from a scientific, a technology standpoint that we'll have to focus on if we're going to continue to meet demand around the world. Okay, so what is the long-term outlook? And first, a little bit of history. This is the global corn market, and it just kind of gives you a little bit of a big picture and some perspective on this chart. If you really look at it hard, 5 of the last 6 years we've had production has exceeded demand. 7 of the last 10 years production has exceeded demand. And so it doesn't take you don't have to be an economist to figure out when you're producing more than you're consuming, you're building stocks, and those are the lines that you see at the bottom. The world has been shielded a little bit from these price increases because China has taken upon itself to build massive corn stocks, and it's turning out to be a fairly significant problem for them managing these stocks, and they're changing their policies internally to accommodate these larger stocks. But really, again, it's a supply problem that we've been running through. But I'm going to skip because we're going to start running low on time. This is a long-term price outlook, and forget about the out years. If you focus on this price projection, what we are thinking is that we're probably going to be in this oversupply situation, certainly 2017, part of 2018, but I think as we look at balancing the supply demand, we're probably going to hit an inflection point where we're going to, and this is always the hardest thing in our business to figure out, is when you're going to have an inflection point and you turn from going down to going up. But it looks like if you work through the numbers, this happens in 2018, and that's a relatively short time frame. But we are still in it, and we're still going to struggle through big stocks. Right now, the southern hemisphere crops look very, very good. In fact, they're getting too much rain in Argentina, probably. But we're going to have another big crop in the southern hemisphere, and we'll have our crop, that will be produced, over the next 12 months. So, we just have too much, and we're going to have to work out of it. But the demand continues to grow, and we'll start chewing through these stocks, and we think we'll hit that inflection point sometime in 2018. Okay, we're running down on just a couple of minutes left to go, and I'm glad that we were able to get to this chart because I think this speaks directly to what you all are doing. Let me just sort of describe these 2 lines. The bottom line is actual acres, and if you go back to 1980 and look at the yellow line on top of it, those are the acres that we would have needed had we not had yield increases. And you can see, coming up to 2016, there's a huge gap between those 2 lines. So that gap represents the efficiency gains that we've achieved from technology. Looking forward, you can see that gap continues to, increase despite the big supplies that we have. And so I think the message here is that the technology that we need to apply to this business is still going to be needed, very much so, as much over the next 5 to 10 years as it has been over the past few years. So I'm coming down on 30 seconds, and I'm glad I got to that chart. There's a couple of other things, but those were the main points. So I thank you for coming in here today, and I'll be around for a few minutes afterwards if anyone wants to catch me and dive into anything a little bit deeper. Ravi?